Is everyone's on? Okay. I think it'd be easier just for me to talk using this so you don't have to strain as much. And if you guys start nodding off, we'll go into karaoke. All right? We'll start doing a little Mac tonight. So thank you everyone for coming out. I want to clarify, somebody asked me when I posted the details for this, they said, Bob, why are you giving a talk on climate change on the opening weekend for Avengers? And I think the real reason is Daniel and I had no idea, we didn't check the calendar to realize, but I am tomorrow, so no spoilers, please. So what I want to talk to you guys today about is the economic response to climate change. So this is one of my areas of expertise. I'm the senior economist at IER, the Institute for Energy Research. So I know we're going to have people here of different levels of knowledge, and so I'll try to, and I'm only going to go 45 minutes and then save 15 minutes for your Q&A. So I'm just going to hit some main things here. This is not going to be the complete story. Obviously, if you want to get more, or if I say something and you want to see some of the documentation for that, by all means, just talk to me afterwards or email me and I'd be happy to help you out. So the first thing I want to stress here is that there is not this clash between these two things. And what often happens is I've been to conferences where I've given talks and my policy conclusions tend to be different from what, like, let's say the conventional wisdom is, or what you would hear in the standard media treatment, like if you're listening to NPR doing a story on climate change and what needs to be done. The impression they would give you was that, oh, everybody who's scientific about this has a certain position, except maybe a few wacky outliers, and anyone who disagrees with that either is ignorant of the science or is a paid shill for big oil, something like that. And so here I want to stress that all of the standard results I'm going to give you are coming from the quote consensus sources. Okay, and so you'll see as we go through this thing that I'm not going to be quoting like from the Heritage Foundation or some rogue scientist out at a mid-tier university. I'll be quoting from like the reports that the UN puts out, or I'll be quoting from the EPA of the Obama administration to make some of the points I'm making. All right. So the main thing I'm stressing here is that this is not ideological per se. So it's true, I do have my own views about political philosophy and the proper role of federal government. I wouldn't trust the people in Washington to intervene in energy markets if they told us, oh, we're doing it because we care about climate change. I don't believe them, right? So that's where I'm coming from personally in terms of my philosophy, but I realize other people might not agree with that, and so here, like I say, for the content of this particular talk and what I'm going to be showing you, you'll see, I mean, you can say maybe I'm biased, but I'm not going to be making appeals about, oh, we can't trust these people. You'll see this is just the rhetoric doesn't fit the standard narrative you hear on NPR and so forth. Okay, so maybe one way to show you how stark this contrast is. So again, what I'm trying to get you to see is a lot of mainstream economists would be for certain measures to mitigate climate change, right? They're for a carbon tax or what's called cap and trade in the Q&A. If you want to bat those around, that's fine. But what I want to stress is that the standard view of what should be done, the way it's presented in the media, the economics of climate change doesn't support that. And the best way I can show you this contrast is, some of you may remember, so it was this last fall, it was the same weekend when this news broke, that on the one hand, the UN, through what's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, they gave this special report showing all the different ways that the governments of the world could take these types of actions in order to try to get close to limiting total global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Right? So that's like the new sort of target, the ambitious target that they're saying this really would err on the side of caution. Things would not get out of hand if we could limit total global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then this thing that came out last fall was the UN, talking to all the various experts in the different fields, giving reports on here's different measures governments could do to try to get towards this goal. At the same time, William Nordhaus he wins the Nobel Prize in economics, and he's one of the pioneers in the economics of climate change. Right? So Nordhaus, going back at least to the 1970s, was publishing articles on like natural resource economics, and then once global warming really started taking off as a serious scientific issue, he started modeling the economics of it. And also, in case you don't know, Nordhaus is not a right-wing person at all. He was one of the co-authors with Paul Samuelson of a famous, let's call it left-wing economics book that was very Keynesian in terms of government, advocating a role for government to smooth out the business cycle. So Nordhaus ideologically is not like a small government person, just so you realize that. And so what's funny is you would think, Nordhaus wins the Nobel Prize for his work on the economics of climate change. The UN's coming out saying these are the things governments need to do to limit warming to 1.5 C, or at least to try to hit that ambitious target. Because look at it, every year is bringing more data about how dangerous climate change is. So you would probably think the guy who just won the Nobel Prize, his work would at least be consistent with that, right? I mean, surely. And actually, no. His own work, I could show you quite clearly that what the UN's target was crazy. All right, and I'll show you a slide. But so this, it would be, I'm trying to think of an analogy that would do this justice. I suppose it would be like when someone wins the Nobel Prize, in medicine, and the Surgeon General comes out with recommendations for whatever, breastfeeding or something, or when to get checked for cancer, and that person's work who just won the award was, saying what the government was doing was totally bad and was going to, harm people. Like, it would be something like that. So this is from Nordhaus's paper he wrote in 2017, just summarizing, his work. And you can see here that, so this text is from him. I just took a screenshot of it. And so that straight line is saying the baseline. So he's saying if the governments of the world did nothing, and these are the years, and this is the total global temperature increase. So how this is quoted is it's from the year 1900. All right, that's the baseline. Okay, so they're saying this is how the Earth would warm. And you can see if the governments of the world, quote, do nothing or do nothing additional beyond when he was doing this analysis, his model showed that by the year 2100, you can see that line goes up, and that's up to about 4 degrees Celsius of warming. Okay, and so wow, that's a lot. That's way above what we hear as the conventional targets. But Nordhaus, that blue line, you see the one with the blue circles there, that's what he calls opt up there. And so that's short here. What that legend means is that's the optimal amount of warming if the governments of the world enacted a carbon tax calibrated to what Nordhaus's model says is the right one. So let me be clear, I don't want you to misunderstand. I'm not saying William Nordhaus is the authority and what he says is final. I'm just saying the guy who won the Nobel Prize for his work on this stuff, if you asked him, your model that you developed, that's one of the cutting edge models in this area, his model was one of the 3 that the Obama administration used when they were modeling this stuff to give recommendations for what they call the social cost of carbon, if you know that phrase. So this is what the experts are using, and I'm saying his own model shows the optimal amount of warming is about 3.5 degrees Celsius through the year 2100. So why would the optimal warming be 0? Right? Why wouldn't you just say let's not have any more global warming if it's a bad thing? And the reason is, well, because it's costly, right? That what's causing human-caused climate change. And notice with this stuff too, I'm totally stipulating for the sake of argument all the conventional physics and chemistry here, so I'm not being a denier. I'm saying on their own terms, this is what the situation is. Human activity releases CO2 and other greenhouse gases that causes the Earth to be warmer than it otherwise would be, and then at some point that starts causing significant harm to humans, and measured in various ways, different types of impacts. So Nordhaus's work was an attempt to say what's the trade-off, that we can limit CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, but there's a reason we emit so much of it right now. It's easy to produce electricity from coal, or it was for a long time. Conventional gasoline's very useful in many respects, right? If it weren't for the fact that global warming is a thing, gasoline would be great, right? It's just now, oh wait, there's this potential negative externality, as economists call it. So what Nordhaus was doing in his work was trying to balance those two things, and he found, his 2017 update at least of his model, he was saying that, yeah, in my mind, that the governments of the world put in the right policies to penalize carbon dioxide emissions the right amount, because you wouldn't want it to go to 0, but you also don't want to just have, the free market decide. He thought that those extremes were both wrong. He was saying in his model, it looks like, yeah, the optimal amount of warming to allow would be about 3.5 C. Now, I know if this isn't your area, okay, the UN says 1.5, he says 3.5, what's the big deal? But there's a huge chasm there in terms of, how much impact that would be. So a lot of natural scientists in this area, the difference then between just 2C and 1.5C is the difference between, catastrophe or not. And I'm not putting words in it, they would call it a catastrophe. So you can imagine 3.5C, I mean, that would be completely unacceptable. They would say, no, there's going to be runaway climate change, and yet the guy who won the Nobel Prize, his own work suggests this. So this is, again, my point here is not to say, oh, Nordhaus is right and the other people are wrong. I'm just saying, isn't that weird that the guy who wins the Nobel Prize at the same time the UN comes out with this thing, his own work shows that goal is far too aggressive. Another way of getting it across to you, so this, I had to go back to his 2007 version of his model, so these numbers, if he updated them, would be different. The reasons I couldn't find him doing this kind of calculation with the update to the model, but this is just to give you an idea of what I mean. So back when he, again, this is Nordhaus's model, back when he was estimating the net benefits or costs of various types of climate policies, right? So these are different things you might do if you were various governments in the world and you were trying to do something to fight climate change. So he said if you did the optimal tax, and by the way, that word DICE, that's just the acronym for his model. It's Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model, something like that. So that's what DICE stands for. So he's saying if you did my optimal carbon tax, humanity would gain about $3.37 trillion on net. Okay, and we don't mean literal dollars, obviously, we mean measuring things in dollar terms. Okay, so again, my point here is not there's anything special or magical about these particular numbers. I just want you to see the magnitude and the sign that he assigned to these various scenarios. So he was saying in the best case scenario, where all the governments of the world did the textbook correct thing, we would avoid a certain amount of potential climate change damage, so those would be the gross benefits, but then we would also have slower conventional economic growth, right? Because we're putting limits, we're using more expensive forms of electricity, it's more expensive to drive our car if we have limits on emissions. So there's a cost. Otherwise, maybe we have emissions go to zero. Why not? Because it's painful. And so he thought where that optimal trade-off is would mean we have $3 trillion in change, more in benefits than in costs. So it's a good thing. We're $3 trillion richer if we do that. Okay, so Nordhaus is not a laissez-faire guy. He wants governments to do something. He's for a carbon tax, and he's saying if you did the right one, we'd be $3 trillion richer measured in a certain way. Okay. So whether you think that's a sensible sentence or not, the issue is look at the other policies. You can see they start doing other types of things and the net benefits go down. If they start doing stuff that's too aggressive, according to him, like limiting atmospheric CO2 to 420 parts per million, and by the way, there are groups out there, there's a website, I think it's 380.org, where they're saying we think the optimal level of CO2 in the atmosphere is 380 parts per million, right? So this is a far looser, more lenient target. And again, Nordhaus back then was saying that would make humanity almost $15 trillion poorer than doing nothing. Okay, so these numbers are the net benefits or costs relative to a do-nothing baseline. Okay, so what I'm just trying to show you is the things that the UN is saying right now would be down here, right? That's if you mapped and said, okay, what do we have to limit the CO2 in the atmosphere to in order to get a 1.5C total warming, they would be down here. So you can see, not only does Nordhaus say that they would hurt, they would be a cure worse than the disease, if you want to think of it like that, but it's several times bigger in magnitude than even the benefits flowing from what he thought would be the optimal policy. Okay, so here again, showing if governments were too aggressive, Nordhaus' work showed that could be far worse than the potential benefits. All right. Let me just mention one somewhat technical point, and don't worry, the whole talk's not going to be this much, but for those of you who are here, you really want to understand part of what's going on in this and why this is a slippery topic, and I think a lot of people don't understand. I could say trick, but that sounds like it's duplicitous, and I'm not saying it is duplicitous, but when people say things like the social cost of carbon, that's what SCC stands for. So that's a technical concept that says how much, when you emit one more ton of CO2, how much net damage does that cause to humanity? And they measure it and they come up with a number. And then that's what the optimal carbon tax is supposed to be. And so what I want to mention to you, though, is that the discount rate you use in that analysis drives everything. All right, and I'll give you an example in a minute just so you can see numerically what I'm talking about. And normally they would use a 3% and a 7% discount rate. Okay, so discount rate just means if you have future costs and benefits, how do you translate them into present costs and benefits? Okay, so this, I just grabbed this because they were at my fingertips. This happens to be from the May 2013 update. I went back to the Obama administration because there's a lot of people don't agree with what people in the Trump EPA did. All right, so I don't want you to be concerned that this is ideological and they're doing something slippery. This was from the Obama administration's EPA when they gave their update in May 2013, or the one I grabbed, of what's called the social cost of carbon, the SCC. This is what they were, if you were following that stuff and you read it in the newspaper, they would be reporting this one probably. So it's a 3% discount rate. So they would say, oh, the social cost of carbon, like in the year 2020, is $43 a ton. So that's saying for every ton of CO2 humanity emits, in a sense, that's causing $43 worth of damage to humanity. You know, that's just because of climate change, all things considered, measured over the next 3 centuries. All right, in the computer simulations, that's where these numbers come from. But if you went from a 3% to a 5% discount rate, all of a sudden, look at how much the social cost of carbon drops. If you go the other way and you make it lower to 2.5%, the social cost of carbon goes up. Okay, so just for example, look at the 2010's numbers. If you use a 3% discount rate, it's $33 a ton. If you use a 5%, it gets cut in a third to $11. Okay, so the size of the numbers isn't the issue here. I just want you to see how much you can make them shrink or expand just by changing that one dial. So again, this has nothing to do with the assumptions about the chemistry or what do clouds do in terms of trapping heat. This has nothing to do with that. We're looking at the same simulation of physical, what happens to Earth and ocean, sea level rises in the computer simulation. And it's just saying, okay, it's under certain, and it runs, thousands of them. It has different, and there's chance variable outcomes and things. And then it looks at all the things and it somehow assesses the damage in money terms and dollar terms. And then over the window collapses it to a present figure in the present. And so I'm saying because the nature of climate change means really bad stuff might happen 150 years from now, they have to come up with a way of saying, okay, well, what if there's $500 billion worth of coastal property damage that doesn't occur until the year 2200? How do we value that right now? So it's not the same thing as $500 billion of damage that happens next Thursday, right? Because it's not going to happen until the year 2200. So you want to make it less than $500 billion, but you also don't want to say, well, let's just ignore it completely, because then that's a big deal. If our actions somehow caused $500 billion of damage in the year 2200, we'd want to take that into account. We wouldn't want to ignore it, but you also wouldn't treat it the same as this $500 billion of damage that you're causing next week. Okay, so that's what the discount rate does. It's saying every year, what percentage do we discount the importance of that cost? And so I'm saying because the nature of these things where they're huge damages that don't occur for decades or longer in the future, you can see how much just tweaking that discount rate affects the numbers. And so what I told you before on the previous slide was the standard thing that federal agencies use, the rule from OMB, when they're doing cost-benefit analysis, just so it's apples to apples, is they say you got to use a 3% rate and a 7% discount rate, and that has to do with like the cost of capital and how much consumers would pay to save money and things like that, how much they're paid to save. That's where those numbers came from at the time OMB issued it. And so just to give you an idea of how screwy this is, the Obama EPA, when they were publishing these results, they didn't publish what the social cost of carbon would be at a 7% discount rate. They just flat out didn't publish it, even though OMB required them to do so. And so all the agencies had to run cost-benefit analyses without that information. And there was stuff like reports would say at a 7% rate, and there'd be an asterisk, and you'd look down at the bottom, and it would say, we actually don't have the 7% rate, so we're using the 5% rate because it's not available. All right, so I'm just saying, like, they were ostensibly complying with the regulation, even though they couldn't. So what I'm now saying to you is, why didn't they give the number? Well, again, look at how this works. At a 3% rate, it's like at $33 a ton. If you bump it up to 5, it drops to 11. If you brought it up to 7%, it would go down even more. And I think in some of these early years, it might actually have been negative. Okay, so they would have been, the computer would have been spitting out the result, if you used a 7% discount rate, that we should be subsidizing coal-fired electricity. You know, we should be sending subsidies to coal miners, which of course is, you know, that's not what they want the answer to be. Okay, so again, it's just a quirk of how these things are modeled. And so my point is, when the story coming forth from the media is that, oh yeah, this is all the science involved, and you know, anyone who's reputable knows there's immediate action we need to take on climate. I'm saying a lot of that is just driven by something as innocuous as, well, what rate are we using to discount the future? And that's clearly not something that a chemist knows the answer to. That's not something from natural science. That's like philosophy, if you will. Okay, so again, just another quirk of this to show you that these are not, you know, this is the Obama administration's own table that I'm showing you this stuff from. Okay, let me use the Paris Agreement to also illustrate, again, this divide between the way it's treated in the media versus if you just dig a little bit and see what the numbers are. So, as many of you I'm sure know, Trump on June 1st, 2017 said that the U.S. is going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. There's a long, drawn-out process by which that would actually be affected if it happens. And the reaction at the time was apocalyptic. So, for example, Stephen Hawking saying this could push Earth over the brink. Paul Krugman in the New York Times had an op-ed saying Trump's id threatens the planet. Okay, and he was saying that we need to elect Hillary, or he was saying we need to elect Hillary Clinton because, you know, what Trump's going to do in terms of deregulation, Earth itself is at stake. All right, so you guys have heard this rhetoric, and so what's interesting is you would think that, okay, according to the consensus literature, then the Paris Agreement must be able to solve the problem. And shoot, if only Trump hadn't ruined it, right? I mean, that clearly has to be the narrative. Otherwise, this reaction doesn't make any sense. Let me just give you a little bit of background about the Paris Agreement. So it was negotiated under UN auspices from representatives from almost 200 countries. It was adopted in December of 2015, and more than 195 parties have signed and 175 have ratified. And what they said in the Paris Agreement was they want to limit global warming, again, they refer to like a pre-industrial baseline, to keep that total warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 C. So again, I've already showed you with the work of Nordhaus, both of those targets don't make it, it would be better to do nothing than those, according to his work. But okay, so that's what it's saying. And then each country announced its own intended contribution. Okay, let me, just as an aside, to put in perspective, you know, how much the U.S.'s decision may or may not matter on this. So it's certainly true that historically the U.S. was a big emitter relative to the rest of the world in terms of CO2. But going forward, I picked the A1B, that's one of the climate scenarios. Using a conventional way to measure emissions or to forecast emissions, you can see that the U.S. going from 2017 to 2100 is only going to have about 11% of total global emissions, whereas India is going to have more, China is going to have about triple the U.S. emissions. All right, so again, it's largely what other countries do anyway on this matter, and so some people say, well, you know, if we don't act quickly, then China's going to take the lead on renewables. Okay, I mean that might be bad.